boy named Jacob lies broken at the bottom of a freezing ravine, his legs shattered, blood blooming over snow. Above him, his horse ghost screams into the void, then leaps down like a phantom carved from wind. No one comes, no one hears, just life barely hanging on, surrounded by wilderness and the fading voice of his mother. And then the old watch on his wrist begins to glow. Subscribe now to follow our most powerful and emotional story films. The snow fell like ash, soft, quiet, and indifferent. A single rusted rail emerged from the frost-bitten earth, jagged and broken, like the exposed bone of a forgotten giant. The camera tracked along it, slowly gliding low, as if the lens itself were trying to find where the path once led. The wind whispered through the pine trees above, shaking loose a flurry of crystals that shimmered like dust in moonlight. In the distance, just beyond the bend, where the tracks abruptly ended, a faint light bobbed through the undergrowth. Footsteps, fast, uneven. A boy no more than 10 dashed into thin frame, threadbare hoodie too large for his bones. Jeans torn at the knees. His breath came in ragged puffs, his face pale with cold, but flushed with urgency. His name was Jacob, though no one had said it out loud in days, maybe weeks. His eyes flicked backward, wide and sharp, like a cornered animal. The flashlight in his hand jittered wildly with each step, casting slashing beams across tree trunks and snowbanks. Behind him, a distant voice, adult angry, called out. Not his name, just "hey," followed by curses that cracked like branches in the air. Jacob didn't slow. He turned off the flashlight and plunged into darkness. He ran until his lungs burned. Then further, until the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath his sneakers and the lonely pulse of his heartbeat in his ears. The woods thickened. The shadows closed in. He stopped near a line of old freight cars, ancient hulks of rust and rivets abandoned decades ago, swallowed halfway by moss and time. The moon broke through the clouds just long enough to outline the edges of a boxcar, its door hanging open like a crooked jaw. Jacob climbed up. He didn't hesitate. Inside it was dark and hollow. The floor creaked beneath him. A dead silence lingered, almost sacred. He closed the door behind him and sat in the far corner, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees. Still no words, only the sound of wind and the thin whistle it made through the cracks in the steel walls. He waited for someone to come. No one did. He pulled his sleeves over his hands, shivering. His fingers fumbled at his wrist. From under the sleeve, he revealed a watch, a plain-worn digital one. The plastic casing yellowed, the band cracked. It lit up blue when he pressed the side. Just for a second. At 23 a.m., that watch didn't keep great time anymore. But he didn't care. It wasn't for time. It was her watch. He clutched it tightly, pressing it against his forehead like a prayer. The light flickered out. He lowered his hands slowly, breathing now in rhythm with the wind. His eyes adjusted to the dark. The corners of the boxcar became less terrifying. Shapes softened. Ghosts receded. He exhaled and finally lay down on the floor, his back against the cold steel. The hoodie barely shielded him, but exhaustion weighed heavier than the cold. Sleep began to pull at his limbs, despite his body still trembling. The camera moved closer now, hovering above his face. His lips parted slightly. His eyelashes flickered. There was a moment just before sleep took him, when his hand once more brushed the face of the watch. Not to check the time, just to be sure it was still there. Still his. Still hers. The wind outside shifted. Time passed. A creaking sound broke the silence. Jacob jerked awake, his breath catching. His ears strained. Another creak, heavier this time, followed by a thud from somewhere outside the car. His heart raced. He sat up quickly, eyes wide, frozen with indecision. He reached slowly for the flashlight, turned it on. The beam shook across the walls. Nothing. He stood, crept to the door, and cracked it open an inch. The wind carried no threats. No voices. No footsteps. Just a sound. Dull, rhythmic, distant. Metal shifting against metal. He stepped down from the boxcar and into the snow. His shoes sank immediately, the cold biting through the thin soles. He moved toward the sound, ducking past another freight car, the flashlight low to the ground. There another open boxcar. This one deeper in the shadows. The sound came from inside. He stepped closer. It was breathing. Heavy, slow, alive. Jacob stopped. The flashlight trembled in his grip. His thumb hovered over the switch, but he didn't turn it off this time. Instead, he inched forward. And then as he reached the doorway, the light caught something, a glint of fur. Gray, matted. A shape too big to be a dog. Muscles coiled like rope flanks, heaving with slow, deliberate rhythm. A mane, thick and tangled, hung like a storm cloud. A horse? No, not just a horse. A beast. It lifted its head slowly. the eyes catching the beam of light and glowing for an instant, a golden reflection that locked eyes with Jacob and held. Neither moved. For a full 5 seconds, the world fell into absolute stillness. Then the horse stepped forward. A slow, shuddering step as if testing whether the boy was real. Jacob didn't run. He didn't scream. He just stood there, knees locked, flashlight aimed not at the animal's face, but toward the ground now. His instincts told him to shrink, to show he wasn't a threat, that he was small and harmless and done running. The horse stopped just inside the threshold, breathing, watching. It was chained. The thick, rusted metal links attached to a ring in the back of the car looped around the animal's hind leg. Cruel, improvised. Not meant for restraint, meant for punishment. Jacob noticed. He lowered the flashlight fully and clicked it off. Let the moon do the work. In that pale silver light, they looked at each other. Two creatures discarded by the world. He took one step closer, barely lifting his feet from the snow. The horse didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. Then Jacob reached into his pocket, pulled out a crust of bread, half frozen. Something he'd saved from dinner 2 days ago. He held it out in the flat of his palm, trembling. The horse's ears flicked. Its head dipped. Closer, closer. It sniffed his hand, then very gently took the bread. Jacob didn't breathe. When the horse pulled away, he smiled. Just slightly. A twitch at the corners of his mouth the first time his face had shifted in hours. The horse chewed, then stepped back into the shadows. Jacob stayed where he was, letting the silence return. The bond had formed. Quiet, invisible, fragile. He turned and walked back to his boxcar. Climbed inside. Curled into his corner. The watch blinked again. 1:47 a.m. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But he reached once more for the watch. And for the first time since the winter began, he closed his eyes, knowing something else was breathing out there in the dark with him. Something like him. Something that hadn't given up. And maybe, just maybe, something that wouldn't. The cold had settled into his bones. Jacob slept curled like a question mark against the wooden floorboards of the boxcar, one arm crooked beneath his head, the other wrapped tightly across his chest. His breath came in small clouds, slow and shallow. Outside, the mountain wind pressed against the steel frame of the car like an uninvited guest howling through the cracks in long, aching sighs. The night was thick, but the cold was thicker. Somewhere far below the cliffs, the town of Silverpine slept unaware. Its lights dimmed beneath a blanket of early snow. But up here on the edge of the world, there were no lights. Only dark and deeper dark beyond that. The boxcar groaned with its own weight, a low shift of metal against metal, then stilled. Jacob stirred but didn't wake. Then, a sound, faint, barely there, not wind. He flinched. Still half asleep, his fingers moved to the flashlight beside him. He didn't turn it on, just clutched it, waiting. Another sound, a dull shuffling scrape. Then something softer, a huff, like breath through heavy nostrils. Jacob opened his eyes, sat up slowly. Everything inside the boxcar looked the same, silent, empty, forgotten. But outside, he slid the door open just a crack, peering into the night. The snow had eased. The trees stood still. A ghost-light moon painted the ground in gray. And there it was again. That sound, not a voice, not footsteps. Breathing, heavy, slow, intentional. He stepped down into the snow boots, crunching flashlight still off. He moved cautiously along the side of the freight line, past one abandoned car, then another. Each one a mausoleum of rust and wood, their walls bent inward from years of storms. Then he saw it. The paddock wasn't even a paddock anymore. Just a crude pen, 4 half-rotted posts with wire fencing sagging like tired shoulders. On one side, part of the fencing had caved inward, revealing a wide gap. There was no gate. And inside that wreck of a structure stood a horse. Not just any horse. It was tall, massive, even its coat a tangle of gray and silver. So wild and thick it almost seemed to shimmer beneath the moonlight. Its mane was overgrown, falling across its face like a veil, and its tail swished once in irritation, or maybe caution. Jacob froze. He knew instinctively that the animal had seen him, felt him. It lifted its head, slowly. The two locked eyes across the clearing. No movement, no sound. Then the horse exhaled one long breath, visible in the cold air, like a signal flare in slow motion. Jacob didn't run, didn't even step back. He simply stared, his eyes, one body motionless except for the soft rise and fall of his chest. The flashlight stayed at his side unlit. He knew somehow that the light would startle the creature. And startling it felt wrong, disrespectful. Like yelling into a church. He took one step forward. The horse didn't move. Another step. Still nothing. Jacob glanced down. The snow had covered something near his foot, a bundle of dried grass and leaves. Possibly stored fodder long abandoned. He knelt, brushed the snow away, and gathered what was left. He stood again, holding the bundle in both hands, like an offering. The horse shifted its weight. Its hooves clinked softly against the stone floor of the pen. One ear flicked. Jacob approached slowly. Each step felt like stepping out onto a frozen lake. He stopped just short of the broken fencing, close enough to see the scars. The animal's side bore several long, jagged reminders of ropes or whips or worse. Its legs were caked in dried mud, and its chest rose and fell like a machine too weary to power down. Their eyes met again. The boy's hand trembled, grass extended. The horse didn't move. Time passed. Jacob's fingers twitched. The cold bit deeper. But he held the position, his expression unchanged. He wasn't sure why. Just that this mattered. And then, a shift. The horse took a step forward, another. Its hooves were soundless on the snow. Jacob could hear nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat, rapid, wild, alive. The animal's nose reached the hay, stopped inches away. Then delicately, it extended its neck and nipped a strand of grass from his hand. Jacob gasped softly, but he didn't flinch. The horse chewed, paused, then took more. And more. Until Jacob's hands were empty. Still neither moved. Jacob lowered his arms slowly. The horse took one last step, its face now inches from the boy's chest. Jacob felt its breath, felt the weight of it, a warmth so real it felt holy. He raised one hand tentatively and let it hover. The horse didn't retreat. He placed it gently on the animal's cheek. It was like touching stone warmed by sun. Rough, solid, alive. A sob caught in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He pressed his forehead to the horse's. There were no words, just breath, and the kind of silence that heals. They stood that way for a long time. Somewhere behind them, a branch cracked in the woods. The horse flicked its ears but didn't startle. Jacob pulled back slowly, his hand lingering on the animal's face for a moment longer before he stepped away. He looked around the pen. There was no food, no water, no shelter. He would come back. He had to. He turned, began to walk back toward the boxcar, then stopped, looked over his shoulder. The horse was still watching him, its eyes deep and dark, almost black in the shadows. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just nodded, once, as if to say, "I see you." And in that quiet moment beneath the dead trees, beside the rusting bones of machines long gone, they made a promise. Unspoken, unbreakable. Two broken things. No longer alone. The fire never came. Not in the belly, not in the heart, not even in the bones. The cold in the mountains wasn't just physical. It had a voice. A stillness that pressed in around you and whispered things you didn't want to remember. Jacob sat with his back against the curved wall of the boxcar, knees hugged to his chest. Flashlight dimmed beside him. The dull amber glow flickered like a dying memory. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead into the dark. Then, darkness cut to darker. A slam, a lock clicking shut. Wooden walls closing around him. The air turned stale, claustrophobic. His breath sped up. He was inside the janitor's closet again. At the foster home. No windows. Just bleach and plastic buckets and the quiet cackling of the boys who shoved him in. "You're lucky we let you eat it all." They laughed through the door. Their footsteps faded. Jacob pounded once, then didn't bother again. Silence was safer. The memory faded in jagged layers, but the feeling stayed. Not fear, not even pain. Abandonment. That cold, gut-deep sense that no one was coming. Not for him, not ever. He blinked, and the present came rushing back. Snow swirling through a broken seam in the boxcar roof, the sound of Ghost moving in the paddock down the hill. The ache in his back from sleeping on steel. Jacob rose slowly, grabbing the flashlight and tucking it into his jacket. He stepped down into the snow again, breath visible in the pale morning light. The sky was still dim, only the faintest hint of color creeping along the edges. He walked toward Ghost without speaking. The horse stood still, unmoving, head low, tail gently swaying. Jacob approached the broken paddock carefully. He noticed now, with daylight peeling back the shadows, just how cruel the chain was wrapped tight around the hind leg, cutting into the skin just above the hoof. It had been there a long time. The wound was scabbed but raw at the edges. He stepped closer. Ghost didn't flinch. Jacob crouched beside the post and examined the lock. It was old, rusty, not complicated. He pulled out a bent fork he'd taken from the shelter days before. He'd been keeping it for food. But now, he slid it between the links and twisted. Nothing. He tried again this time, gritting his teeth, putting his weight behind it. The metal groaned, and then with a loud snap, the lock fell apart. The chain unraveled from Ghost's leg like a snake retreating into the earth. Jacob fell back onto the snow, breathing hard. Ghost didn't move. He simply turned his head, looked at Jacob, then looked at his own leg. The weight was gone, but the habit remained. He stood as if still tethered. Jacob waited. Ghost stepped forward once, hesitated. Then another step, and another. Jacob stood slowly. The horse passed the broken fence without fanfare. No triumphant gallop. No defiant snort. Just a quiet walk, one hoof after the other, straight to where Jacob stood. He stopped just beside him. Not behind. Not ahead. Beside. Jacob reached up, brushing the horse's neck with his knuckles. The fur was thick, coarse with dirt. Underneath, the muscles rippled like wire under cloth. He didn't know how long they stood like that. Then he looked up the hill and began to climb. Ghost followed. There was no saddle, no rope, no voice telling the horse to come. He just did. Together they moved slowly, ascending the snowy trail until they reached the ridge. It wasn't far, but steep enough that Jacob had to catch his breath once they crested. From the top, the entire town of Silverpine lay below. Tiny houses with chimneys puffing smoke into the frozen morning. Roads empty. The school, the train yard, the abandoned spur where the freight line used to run. Jacob turned away from all of it. Instead, he looked down at the track beneath his feet. The rails ended just 10 paces ahead. Broken, twisted, like someone had started building a path and then changed their mind halfway through. The rust bled into the gravel like a wound that had never scabbed. Jacob stood on the very edge of it, his shoes toes just inches from where the metal stopped. And he thought about everything that had stopped too. His mom, his name being said with love, the idea of someone waiting for him anywhere. This track led nowhere. Just like him, he took out the watch. The cracked plastic reflected the gray light of dawn. It wasn't ticking. But he didn't care. He clutched it in his palm and stared down that broken rail, his chest rising and falling like the engine of a train long overdue. Beside him, Ghost lowered his head. Jacob reached out and placed the watch on the rail. Just for a second, as if to say, this is where it ends. And maybe, just maybe, where it begins. Behind him, a gust of wind whipped through the trees. Ghost's ears twitched. Jacob turned, looking back down the hill, and saw the skeletal lines of the boxcars in the clearing below. The hollow echoes of last night's silence still lingered there. He knelt, picked up the watch, and slipped it back on his wrist. Then they descended together, slow, measured, deliberate. When they reached the clearing again, Jacob led Ghost to the open side of the largest boxcar. He hesitated for only a moment, then walked inside. Ghost followed. It took effort. The metal groaned under his weight. The floorboards shuddered. But he fit. Barely. Jacob cleared a corner and pulled down a few pieces of tarp, some old hay bales, a frayed wool blanket he'd stuffed into his backpack from the shelter. He laid them out as best he could, working in silence. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at Ghost. The horse stood in the center of the car, motionless. Jacob reached into his bag again, pulled out an apple, small bruised, and held it out. Ghost stepped forward, took it gently, and crunched. Jacob smiled. Not wide, just enough to soften the lines in his cheeks. He sat down beside the horse. Not under him, not behind him, beside him. The two of them facing the doorway. Snow falling again, more gently this time. Jacob pulled the blanket over his shoulders and leaned into the warmth of Ghost's side. Not much, just enough. Ghost turned his head slightly, exhaled through his nose, and then they both sat, watching the snow, listening to nothing, saying everything. The fog came early that morning, rolling low and slow off the pines, curling around the boxcars like smoke from a forgotten fire. Jacob stood at the edge of the clearing, a rusted pail in one hand, snow up to his ankles. His breath curled upward in fragile spirals. He glanced over his shoulder toward the boxcar where Ghost was resting half covered in a ratty wool blanket. The horse had not moved much since the night before. He'd eaten just enough to survive, drank just enough to stay upright. But that look in his eyes, that wary, wounded stillness, hadn't left. Jacob wiped his nose on his sleeve, then began breaking the ice on the old metal trough near the fence. The water inside was murky, tinged with rust. He looked around. No hose, no spigot, just a snow-covered ridge and the far-off promise of a stream he hadn't dared approach yet. He sighed, tapped the pail against the trough. It echoed. Hollow. Not today, he muttered under his breath. Not dying today. He didn't realize he was being watched. Not until he turned to head back toward the car. A figure stood about 50 feet away, leaning against a cane half shadowed by the skeletal frame of a burned-out barn. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, his shape hunched like the trees behind him, his coat heavy with dust and time. Jacob froze. They locked eyes across the clearing. It wasn't the boy who blinked first, it was the man. He pushed off the cane, slightly shifting his weight forward with effort. One leg dragged slightly behind him. It wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Deliberate. Like each step had been bargained for. The man came forward 10 paces, then stopped again. Jacob stood between him and Ghost, shoulders squared, chin tucked like a boxer waiting for a punch. Didn't mean to trespass, Jacob said quietly, his voice rough from sleep and silence. The man said nothing. He just looked past the boy toward the horse in the car. A long breath, then a nod. Jacob turned, glancing back at Ghost. When he looked again, the man was walking, no limping, toward the trough. He set the cane against the fence, rolled up his sleeve slowly, and reached into the basin. With bare hands, he began scooping out slush and muck, flinging it behind him, in wet frozen chunks. Jacob blinked. After a minute, the man pulled from his coat pocket a worn cloth. He tied it over his hand, dipped a tin cup into the fresher snow nearby, packed it, and dumped it into the trough. Then again, Jacob stepped closer. "You live up here?" he asked, unsure if his voice even carried. The man didn't answer. Instead, he pointed with his chin to the pail still hanging from Jacob's hand, then pointed toward the ridge behind them, toward the trees, where the stream might be. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. He walked. The pail bumped against his leg with each step. No words were exchanged. But something unspoken had shifted, an invisible thread pulled taut between them. The man watched him disappear into the trees. When Jacob returned 20 minutes later, hands numb, pant legs soaked, the man had already cleared out a new section of the boxcar. He had opened both doors, letting in cold but light, and arranged a few broken crates into a makeshift feeding station. He didn't comment when Jacob set the pail down, just dipped 2 fingers into it, tested the clarity of the water, and nodded slightly. Ghost stirred. The man stepped forward slowly, carefully. He didn't reach out. He didn't try to touch. Instead, he stood just outside the boxcar and waited. Ghost eyed him with quiet distrust, ears swiveling. The horse took 1 step back. The man responded by stepping back as well. A dance of boundaries. Silent consent. Jacob watched from the corner, holding his breath. The man turned, walked away. Not far, just to the edge of the clearing. There he lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled not from fear, but from memory. His face was worn, not just with age, but with weight, loss, responsibility that didn't shrink with time. Jacob approached him cautiously. "My name's Jacob," he offered. The man flicked ash into the snow. "You feeding him?" Jacob nodded, cleaning his leg. Another nod. "You plan on running when it gets hard?" Jacob shook his head. A long pause. Then the man finally spoke. "Name's Keaton. This land used to be mine." Jacob's eyes darted toward the trees, the crumbling barn, the fence lines swallowed by snow. "Still is," Keaton added, shrugging, "but the horses are mostly ghosts now." The word hung in the air. "Ghost?" Jacob swallowed. "I didn't steal him," he said. "I know. You gonna call someone?" Keaton looked at him, long and hard. "No." He didn't explain why, didn't ask for Jacob's story, didn't demand a plan or promise. He just walked back toward the boxcar, slow but steady, then gestured to a pile of hay bales and a rusted pitchfork leaning against the wall. "You want him to live?" "You need to keep his hooves dry," he said. "You know how to muck." Jacob shook his head. "You'll learn." And that was it. The first seed planted. The next hour unfolded without conversation. Keaton didn't bark orders. He didn't offer encouragement. He simply moved, adjusted, demonstrated, waited. When Jacob stumbled with the pitchfork, he didn't correct him with words. He took the tool, silently did the task once, then handed it back. When Ghost grew restless, Keaton whistled low and steady, a sound that seemed to come from the ribs more than the throat. Ghost stilled, responded. Jacob noticed, mimicked, failed, tried again. Later, Keaton crouched near Ghost's leg, unwrapped the old cloth Jacob had used, and began mixing a crude poultice with herbs pulled from a pouch on his belt. He worked slowly, explaining nothing. But his hands told the story steady, practiced, respectful. Jacob watched every movement. "Where'd you learn all that?" he asked finally. 30 years in rodeos, 20 training rescues." Jacob paused, and the limp, 15 seconds too late in a thunderstorm. "Lightning doesn't care who you are." Jacob didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. That night, as dusk fell and the first stars blinked alive, Jacob sat beside Ghost again. The horse's breathing was steadier now, the twitch in his leg less sharp. Keaton leaned against a tree, arms crossed, eyes on the moon rising over the ridge. "You planning on staying?" he asked without turning. Jacob thought about it, then said, "I don't know yet." Keaton nodded almost to himself. "You'll need to earn it either way." And with that, he walked back toward the barn cane, tapping a quiet rhythm in the snow. The clearing returned to silence, but it wasn't empty anymore. It pulsed with something new. Not warmth, not yet, but direction, like the hum of a train in the distance. And Jacob, for the first time in his life, leaned toward it. The town of Silver Pine lay quiet in the shadow of the cliffs, its narrow streets half buried under fresh snow, its porch lights glowing weakly through the morning mist like tiny ships adrift in fog. The post office had been closed for 3 days. The market operated on reduced hours, and up on Ash Street, in a white clapboard house with peeling shutters and a crooked mailbox, Alma Trinity was staring out her frost-covered window, alone. The radio murmured in the background. Static and Bach. Her teacup sat untouched. The clock on the mantel hadn't ticked in years. She didn't need it to. She had routine instead, quiet, cold, and absolute. Each morning she boiled water not to drink it, but to feel the steam on her face. She'd take down one of the porcelain cups from the cupboard she hadn't opened since the funeral. Then she'd set it on the table, in front of the empty chair across from hers, and wait. Today, like every day, no one sat in it. Her knees ached as she stood. She winced, shuffled to the coat rack, pulled on her thick brown wool overcoat, and stepped into boots too big for her ankles now. Outside, the wind cut through her scarf before she made it halfway down the porch. She walked to the end of her path, bent down, picked up the newspaper. That's when she saw him. A boy, thin, muddy, dragging a feed sack twice his size up Main Street like it was punishment. He looked out of place, unwashed, uninvited. Alma narrowed her eyes. The boy struggled to hoist the sack higher onto his back. The contents, dried hay and scraps of oats, shifted, almost toppling him. She stepped forward, her voice sharp. That's not yours." The boy froze mid-step. She stormed toward him. "I've seen you before, up near the ridge. With that beast." Jacob lowered the sack carefully, his back stiff. He didn't respond. "You think you can just come down here and take whatever you want?" she snapped. "It was going to rot in the bin behind the store," Jacob said low. Alma stepped closer. "And that makes it yours." Jacob looked up at her, and she saw it, the filth on his face, the scabs on his lip, the bruise beneath his jaw. But what caught her wasn't the wounds. It was the glint of the watch on his wrist. Faded blue, cracked face, Velcro strap fraying at the edges. The same watch her son had worn the morning the train left the tracks. She stared, her breath caught. She reached forward before she realized she was moving. "Where did you get that?" Jacob took a step back. "It's mine." "No." "That watch," she blinked. "That watch belonged to..." He turned to lift the feed sack again. "Wait." He stopped. Her voice had changed. She didn't know why she said it, or what she wanted him to do, but he waited. Alma swallowed. Her hands were trembling, not from cold. She stepped forward slowly this time, looked down at the watch again. "It looks just like his," she said almost to herself. Jacob didn't ask who. She didn't volunteer. The silence between them was taut, and for the first time, she didn't try to fill it. Then she said, "You're feeding that animal." Jacob nodded once. "What's it to you?" Alma stiffened. "Nothing," she snapped. Then added more quietly, "Just don't let it suffer." Jacob looked at her again. Really looked. Something in his face softened. Maybe pity. Maybe understanding. Or maybe just exhaustion. He picked up the sack again and turned to go. Alma didn't stop him. She stood there, in the middle of the street, the wind swirling her coat around her legs, her heart pounding in her chest like it hadn't in years. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window instead, staring out across the snow-lit street, replaying the moment over and over. The watch, the face, the cold in his voice, the quiet rage. It was the same quiet her son had spoken with the night before he boarded that train. She'd been cruel. She'd told him to stop being weak, to stop dreaming. She'd told him the world would chew him alive if he didn't harden first. She'd never get the chance to take it back. The train derailed 30 minutes outside of Denver. The conductor walked away. Her son didn't. In the morning, Alma walked down to the grocer. She waited in line. When it was her turn, she asked for a burlap sack of grain and a box of sugar cubes. Then she wrote a name on a torn piece of paper and handed it to the clerk. "Deliver this to the boy with the gray horse," she said. The clerk frowned. "You mean the one up past the ridge?" Alma didn't answer. She just paid and walked out. Later that afternoon, Jacob returned to the boxcar after a long failed attempt to fix a cracked bucket. He found the sack leaning against the door, tied at the top with twine, a note pinned to the side. No name, no greeting, just a short sentence. Even ghosts get hungry. Jacob stared at it for a long time. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he sat beside it, hand resting on the top as if it might vanish if he turned his back. Ghost wandered close, sniffed it curiously, then looked at Jacob for permission. Jacob smiled. Just a little. They opened it together. Inside oats, dried apples, salt licks, and tucked beneath it all, a folded blue rag. It was old. Smelled faintly of lavender. The kind of thing only someone's mother would pack. Jacob didn't cry. Not yet. But later that night, when Ghost lay down for the first time since the day they met, curled on his side, breathing slow, steady, Jacob rested his head against the horse's shoulder and whispered, "Somebody saw us today." Ghost didn't move, but his ear flicked gently. That was enough. The wind shifted. It came low and fast that morning, curling through the canyons with a howl like something wounded. Trees bent in clusters along the ridgeline, and even the birds, always shrill and frantic in the dawn, had fallen silent. The horses below the tree line stirred uneasily. And in the boxcar, Jacob sat up straight. Something felt wrong. He pulled the wool blanket off his shoulders and looked out. The sky was too still. The quiet, too sudden. Even Ghost was standing stiffly now, his ears pitched forward, body tense. Then the ground trembled. Not much, just enough to unsettle the frost clinging to the wood beams overhead. A heartbeat later, it came louder, deeper, a low groan from the earth itself. Then a sound like thunder breaking apart. Jacob rushed outside barefoot in the snow. Ghost followed, nostrils flared. From the ridge, they saw it happen. The side of the mountain gave way. A wall of snow rock and trees collapsed like an ocean wave, crashing over the road, that wound down into the valley. The only road into or out of Silverpine. An old delivery truck tried to reverse, but it was too late. The avalanche swallowed it whole. Dust and white powder rose like smoke, and then silence. Not the peaceful kind, the stunned, breathless kind. Jacob turned, bolted down the hill toward Mr. Keaton's cabin. Inside, the old man was already pulling a battered transistor radio from beneath a pile of old blankets. He tuned it furiously, knob clicking the antenna, snapping upright like a soldier at attention. "Come on," Keaton muttered. Come on. Static. Crackle. Then, mudslide reported at mile marker 12. High risk of additional collapse. All access routes blocked. Emergency crews delayed. Silverpine currently unreachable. Keaton let the radio fall into his lap. Jacob stood frozen in the doorway. "Cell towers will be down," Keaton said grimly. "Power lines, too. That road was our lifeline. If they don't get through..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Jacob clenched his fists. "There has to be another way." Keaton shook his head. "Not unless you know how to fly?" Jacob's eyes darted to the window, toward the trees, toward the ridge. "No roads," he said, "but there are trails, old ones." Keaton followed his gaze. "You don't know where they go." "I don't need to," Jacob said. "As long as they go down." Keaton stared at him a moment, then limped over to the corner, rummaged through a wooden crate. He pulled out a map, crease torn, half the ink faded. He laid it on the table. "Here," he pointed. "You're here. Closest ranger station is on the other side of the canyon. 20 miles. More if you zigzag to avoid rockfall." "I'll take Ghost," Jacob said. Keaton raised a brow. "You sure he's ready?" Jacob looked toward the hill where the gray mane rippled against the wind. "I think we both are." They packed fast. Canteens, dried fruit, bandages, a compass, the watch. Jacob tightened the strap around his wrist. It was dead, but somehow it still ticked inside his head. Keaton handed him a scarf. "Thick woolen, moth-bitten. This used to be mine," he said. "Don't die in it." Jacob smirked. "I'll do my best." They met Ghost near the edge of the trail. The horse stood still, already sensing the shift, already bracing for what lay ahead. Jacob mounted bareback. No reins. Just his hands gripping Ghost's mane, his legs tight against the sides. Keaton watched them as they turned. Then just before they disappeared into the trees, he called out, "Make noise if you run into a bear. Don't try to look brave. Just be loud." Jacob smiled faintly. "Got it." And then they were gone. The forest swallowed them whole. From above they were just a dot. A whisper. A flicker of white moving through an ocean of black trees. Ghost moved like water. Fast, silent, sure-footed even on the frozen ground. Jacob leaned low, guiding him with the smallest shift of weight, listening to the rhythm of hooves on ice and earth. The path narrowed. Branches clawed at his face. Snow fell from high limbs in sudden bursts. But they kept going. The world was a blur of motion and breath. 3 miles in, they reached a clearing. Jacob pulled Ghost to a stop. The silence here was deeper. He could feel it in his ribs. A small wooden bridge stretched over a creek half choked with snow and stone. One post was cracked. A warning. Jacob slid off. Ghost led him slowly across. The bridge groaned beneath them, but held. Once across, they paused. Ghost's sides heaved. Steam poured off his back. Jacob pressed his forehead against the horse's shoulder. "We're okay," he whispered. "You're okay." Then they pushed forward. Another mile, then another. Time stretched. Distance folded in on itself. Each turn looked like the last. Every hill seemed higher than the one before. Then movement, a crash in the underbrush. Jacob froze. A buck bolted across the path ahead of them, followed by a fox, quick and bright, and vanishing in a blink. Ghost didn't spook. He just watched, then kept moving. They reached a rocky incline by dusk. Jacob dismounted, began climbing on foot, tugging Ghost along carefully. The trail narrowed to nothing, then opened again, like the mountain couldn't make up its mind whether it wanted them there. As darkness approached, the cold deepened. Jacob's fingers numbed. His lips cracked. His stomach gnawed at itself. Still he pushed forward. He knew what waited if they turned back. Nothing. No heat. No help. No hope. But forward. Maybe. Just maybe. The forest shifted again around mile 11. The trees grew wider apart. The snow thinner. The air carried the scent of smoke, faint but real. Jacob's heart leapt. He looked down at the watch. It blinked. Dead screen. But in his head, he saw numbers. And they said, "Keep going." Ghost nudged his back gently. And so they did. Up ahead, the trail dipped suddenly, revealing the edge of a ridge. And beyond it, lights. Tiny. Golden. Alive. Jacob's knees buckled, but he didn't fall. Ghost stood tall beside him, chest rising like the mountain itself. Jacob reached for the watch again. Pressed it to his lips. "We made it." Then he collapsed into the snow, breathless, but not broken. Behind him, Ghost bowed his head gently, touching the boy's shoulder, as if to say, "I was never just following you." The forest grew strange as dusk collapsed into night. Shapes shifted. Trails forked and vanished. Even the moonlight, which had followed them, like a quiet guardian through the early miles, was gone, hidden now behind thick clouds that hung low over the pines. Everything was damp, cold, uneasy. Jacob tightened his grip on Ghost's mane. They had been walking for hours, but the terrain had changed. This wasn't the trail marked on Keaton's map. This wasn't any trail at all. Ghost stopped. His ears turned sharply to the left, catching something in the dark that Jacob couldn't hear. Then came the noise, a distant crack, the sound of something collapsing in the underbrush. Jacob froze. Which way, he whispered. Ghost didn't move. A beat, then another. Then the ground beneath them gave way. It wasn't an earthquake, or a landslide, or even a trap. It was simpler than that. Just a patch of earth, weakened by frost, crumbling beneath their weight. Jacob fell first. He didn't scream. He didn't even have time. He tumbled backward off the ridge branches, slapping his face, rocks tearing at his clothes, before slamming into the base of a ravine, hard. The pain was instant. Blinding. His ankle twisted beneath him at a sickening angle, and for a long moment he couldn't breathe. Above him, Ghost whinnied a sharp, panicked sound that echoed like thunder in the ravine walls. Jacob blinked, coughed. His chest ached, his vision blurred. He tried to move, but pain shot through his leg like electricity. He screamed, not out of fear, out of fury. God! He punched the frozen ground. Then again. It didn't help. It never had. Ghost paced at the edge of the ridge hooves, striking the stone with nervous rhythm. Jacob looked up, tears blurring his vision. "Don't just stand there," he shouted. Ghost neighed, stomped, took a few steps back, then ran forward and leapt. The great gray body cleared the edge with a grunt of effort, landing hard beside Jacob's snow and dust exploding around them. "Are you insane?" Jacob said, but his voice cracked halfway through. Ghost lowered his head and pressed it into Jacob's chest. Warm, solid, alive. Jacob reached for the horse's neck, grabbing fistfuls of coarse, matted mane. Then the sobs came. Not little tears, not sniffles. The kind of crying that ruptured from the belly-ugly, unfiltered wild. "I hate this," he choked. "I hate everything." Ghost stood still, only moving to breathe. Jacob beat his fist against the animal's side weakly. "They left me, all of them." He gasped for air. His face pressed against Ghost's shoulder snot and salt mixing with the warmth of fur. "My mom, she got sick and she said she'd be okay. She said it'd just be a few days, then she was gone." He couldn't stop shaking. "They sent me away like I didn't matter." The memory of the social worker's perfume, sterile and sweet. The duffel bag with someone else's name scribbled over his. The dormitory. The voices in the hallway calling him trash boy. Ghost shifted slightly, then knelt. It wasn't graceful, more like surrender. The horse lowered himself fully into the snow beside Jacob, laying his body along the boy's side, as if trying to keep him warm. Jacob lay against him, broken, shaking, breathing in that strange wild scent, sweat earth fur. Ghost licked Jacob's leg right at the ankle. His tongue was rough, but careful, slow, and steady over and over, until Jacob winced. It hurt, but it grounded him. It said, "You're here. You're still here." Jacob closed his eyes and remembered. A voice, soft, worn from laughter. His mother's voice just before bedtime, tracing the edges of his ear with her fingertip, whispering through the dark. "You always matter, Jacob. Even when the world forgets how to see you. You still matter." She would press a kiss just below his temple and say, "No one ever gave you worth. You were born with it." He hadn't remembered that in so long, and now, lying in the snow in the middle of nowhere, bleeding and bruised, he heard it louder than ever. "You are not disposable." He opened his eyes. The night pressed in, but Ghost's body pulsed with heat, with presence, with something deeper. Jacob raised his hand, trembling, and placed it against the horse's chest. "I don't want to disappear," he whispered. Ghost's breathing slowed. Neither moved, neither spoke, but something shifted. A door inside Jacob that had been locked for years creaked open, just a crack. A tiny golden sliver of belief that he was not a mistake, that being loved once was enough to be loved again, that surviving didn't have to mean staying angry forever. He sat up slowly, teeth clenched against the pain. Ghost lifted his head. Jacob reached for a branch, thick, sturdy, and jammed it under his arm for balance. He leaned into Ghost, using the horse's massive body for support. "I'm not done," Jacob said more to himself than anyone else. He looked up toward the ridge, then down at his ankle. "Can you carry me?" Ghost didn't answer. He just stood, slow, steady, sure. Jacob pulled himself onto the horse's back, wincing. He gripped the mane again, burying his face into Ghost's neck. "I've got you," he said, as if their roles had reversed. Ghost stepped forward. Then again, each step rang with new purpose. With every movement, Jacob's pain pulsed. But it didn't crush him. It reminded him, "You're alive." They moved up the ravine slowly, step by step toward the edge where the fall had begun. Above them, the moon broke through the clouds again. A soft light spilled down through the trees, illuminating the white figure in motion, and the boy riding him not triumphant, but transformed. Behind them, the earth closed around their tracks. Ahead of them, the forest waited. And somewhere far beyond, a signal still whispered, A cry not just for help, but for meaning. The wind had changed again. It came now in short, sharp bursts, slicing through the trees with an edge of urgency. The kind of wind that didn't whistle but warned. The sky above was a bruised canvas clouds, stacked like heavy thoughts, sun, nowhere in sight. Jacob clung to Ghost's mane, hunched low over the horse's back. Every step jolted his leg. The pain was no longer sharp, it had settled into something deeper, more primal. Something that lived in the bones and whispered, "Stop. Lie down. Disappear." But he didn't. Not now. Not when they were this close. The ridge they were climbing wasn't marked on any map. It rose like a spine from the forest floor, jagged and narrow, and led toward a line of cliffs Jacob had only glimpsed from a distance before. He didn't know what was up there. He only knew what was behind them, nothing. He reached for his watch. The screen was still cracked, still dim, but he pressed the button anyway. Nothing. He held it longer. A weak pulse of blue lit the edges. Faint. Flickering. Jacob swallowed hard. The GPS signal, if it was even working, would be weak out here, scattered by cloud cover and mountains. But it was all he had. All they had. He raised his wrist high into the air, lifting it above his head, as if reaching for God himself. The gesture felt absurd, desperate. The wind caught the sleeve of his coat, snapping it like a flag. Snow blew sideways. His fingers trembled. Still he held the watch toward the sky. Higher. The clouds swirled. He whispered not to Ghost this time, but to the sky. "Please." Behind him, Ghost grunted, pushing forward, hooves digging into the snowpack. They kept moving. At a small search and rescue post 20 miles away, a screen flickered. A technician, half asleep with coffee gone cold beside her, leaned forward and tapped a few keys. "Got something," she muttered. The screen showed nothing but a ping, one bar blinking red. No coordinates, no name. But there it was. A pulse, a life. Another tech leaned in. "Looks like it's bouncing off one of the ridge towers. Can't be more than a minute-long signal," she said. "It's vanishing." "Mark the quadrant," he replied. "Send the drone team." The message was logged, the coordinates estimated. Back on the ridge, Jacob's arm dropped. The weight too much now. He tucked the watch back beneath his sleeve, not because he didn't believe in it, but because he had nothing left to give it. They were close to the cliff edge now. He could see it ahead. Jagged rocks like broken teeth, the trees falling away into nothing. The trail narrowed even more. Then it ended. Literally. A sheer slope slick with ice led to a plateau just above. No path, no steps, just incline. Steep, mean, laughing. Jacob slipped off Ghost's back and collapsed into the snow. He couldn't walk. His ankle was purple, and twice its normal size. Each attempt to put pressure on it made the world go white around the edges. He looked up the slope, then at Ghost. "I can't." The words barely made it out of his mouth. Ghost stared at him, silent, then stepped forward and lowered his head. Jacob's eyes blurred. "No." Ghost moved closer, nudging Jacob's shoulder. Jacob reached up and gripped the horse's mane. "Don't do this." But Ghost did. He turned sideways, positioning himself so Jacob's arms could loop around his neck from behind. Jacob pulled himself forward, teeth clenched. Ghost dug in. With a grunt of effort, the horse took a step. And another. Snow crumbled beneath his hooves. His breath came hard now, visible in the air like smoke signals. Jacob clung to him, barely conscious. The world narrowed to one thought up. Ghost slipped once, his front hooves skidding, but he caught himself, muscles screaming beneath his skin. Step, step, step. At one point, Jacob's weight dragged him backward, but Ghost didn't falter. He twisted his neck, grabbed Jacob's coat collar in his teeth, and pulled, like dragging the memory of a dying world behind him. The top came into view, a flat stretch of land covered in snow, open, exposed, but wide enough for a signal to pass. Ghost stumbled once more, but this time it was forward. They collapsed together onto the ridge. Jacob lay in the snow, his body heaving. Ghost beside him, sides rising and falling like a bellows. They didn't move, didn't need to. Somewhere in the air above them, a signal trembled upward. Below, far in the trees, the sound of rotor blades grew louder. The room smelled like antiseptic, and something sterile underneath bleached cotton sheets waxed linoleum. The quiet hum of machines monitoring a body the world didn't think worth saving. Jacob blinked against the white light above him. For a moment he thought he was back in the storage closet again. Back in that foster home, locked in silence, with nothing but his own breath and an old mop for company. But the ceiling here was too clean, the air too sharp. And there was a beep, rhythmic and gentle, like someone whispering, "You're still here in code." He sat up slowly. His ankle was bandaged tight, his ribs too. Pain bloomed across his chest when he moved, but it didn't scare him. It was honest pain. Earned. A nurse noticed, pushed through the curtain. "You're awake," she said, voice light but cautious. "They've been asking about you." Jacob frowned. "Who? Social services?" "Of course." He sank back into the bed eyes on the small table beside him. His watch was there, cracked, blinking softly. Alive. The door opened again 20 minutes later, and this time it wasn't a nurse. It was a man and a woman. Early 40s, dressed like comfort catalogs, wool coats with leather trim, matching scarves, kindness polished to a high gloss. They smiled too easily. Their hands held each other too tightly, like they'd practiced this moment in the car. "Jacob," the woman said, as if she'd known him forever. He didn't respond. "We've heard so much," the man added. "What you did. It's unbelievable." "You're incredibly brave," the woman chimed in. "Truly." Jacob looked at the door, then back to them. They stood awkwardly, not sure whether to sit. "We have a small farm just outside of Denver," the man continued. "Not horses, but dogs. A whole pack of retrievers. Big yard. A view of the mountains. And you'd have your own room." The woman leaned forward. "Warm food, clean sheets. And school if you're ready for that again. No pressure." Jacob studied their faces. The lines around their eyes were tight, tired. Maybe good people. Maybe not. He didn't care. He reached slowly for his watch and slid it back onto his wrist. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I don't want to be chosen." The couple froze. "I want to be trusted." Silence. The woman blinked. "I don't understand." Jacob didn't explain. He pulled the blanket off, swung his legs over the bed, and winced as his feet touched the floor. "I'm not a pet you rescue. I'm not a story for your dinner table." The man raised a hand. "We didn't mean." Jacob stood. His voice didn't shake. "I belong somewhere already." 2 days later, a transport van rolled up to the edge of Silver Pine. The storm had cleared, but the road was still fragile snow piled in walls, mud frozen in strange sculptures across the pavement. The van door opened, and Jacob stepped out with his coat zipped halfway, a cane tucked under one arm, and a paper bag of antibiotics in the other. Keaton was waiting. He didn't wave, didn't step forward, just stood on the porch, arms folded, a steaming mug in one hand. Jacob approached slowly. "Thought you'd be gone by now," Keaton muttered. "I was," Keaton grunted. "They try to sell you on the mountains." "And retrievers?" Keaton snorted. "City dogs." Jacob climbed the steps, paused. "I left something here," he said. "Oh yeah, my life?" Keaton didn't smile, but he opened the door. Jacob stepped inside. That night, Ghost stood still as Jacob brushed the snow from his mane. The gray was darker in places, now wet and tangled from days of weather. But his eyes were clearer. Jacob pressed his forehead to the horses. "You knew I'd come back," he whispered. Ghost didn't move. Didn't need to. Behind them, the cabin light glowed warm against the snow. A new wood stove crackled. The scent of something soft stew maybe drifted out into the cold. And on the porch, under a folded blanket, was a small brown box. No note, just a photo inside. Black and white, worn at the edges. A boy with a kind smile, wearing the same watch Jacob now wore, standing beside a woman who couldn't quite hide her pride behind her scowl. Alma. Jacob held the photo for a long time, then folded it, pressed it into the crack of the cabin wall above the mantel, and sat down beside the fire. The door creaked. Keaton stepped in, pulled off his gloves, dropped them in a basket by the stove. "Storm's coming again tomorrow," he said. Jacob nodded. "I'm not going anywhere." The snow came early that winter. It drifted down from the peaks in slow, deliberate spirals, blanketing the hills in silence. The trail that once led to nowhere had been widened, cleared by boots' hooves and time. It curved gently now through the edge of the forest, past the old boxcars and into the field where the barn had been rebuilt. Not flashy, not clean, but alive. Jacob stood at the gate, taller now, his shoulders broader. He was 17, though he still looked younger in the way that people do when they've had to grow up too fast and too alone. His hair was longer, tucked beneath a knit cap. His boots were worn, but well kept. A soft green scarf wrapped around his neck, Alma's, though neither of them had spoken about it. He opened the gate and led Ghost forward. The horse moved slowly, carefully, every step measured. Time had added a few streaks of white to his mane. But his eyes were sharper now, more present. When he walked beside Jacob, he no longer scanned the woods for threat. He looked toward the barn. Inside, the laughter had already started. Children. 5 of them. 2 in wheelchairs, 1 with a leg brace, the others marked not by what was visible, but by the way they hesitated before trusting the space they were in. Mr. Keaton leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, that old cane still dangling from one hand, like an extension of his stubbornness. "Good timing," he muttered as Jacob approached. "I live here," Jacob replied with a faint grin. Keaton grunted. "Still doesn't mean you're always on time." Jacob patted Ghost's shoulder. "Let's change that." They moved together into the open pen. Ghost paused once at the edge, as if sensing the day, the air the way it trembled with something important. Then he stepped forward. The children were gathered in a circle near the straw bales. One of the volunteers, a college kid named Reuben, who'd grown up in Denver, was helping a girl with tremors tie her boots tighter. The others looked up when Ghost entered and fell silent. It always happened like this. Ghost wasn't the biggest horse they'd seen. He wasn't the prettiest either. But he had something else. A weight. a presence, a quiet that reached into people before they had a chance to hide. Jacob didn't announce him. He didn't need to. Ghost moved to the center of the pen and simply stood there, waiting. The girl with the tremors stepped forward first. Her name was Ava, 9 years old. Hadn't spoken since the accident. Jacob knelt beside her. "You want to try?" She didn't nod. Didn't shake her head either. She just stared at Ghost, eyes wide. Jacob didn't push. He placed his hand over hers and let her feel his breath, slow even. "Match mine," he whispered. "He'll match yours." She watched his chest rise. Then hers did. Tiny. Then again. Ghost stepped forward. She tensed but didn't retreat. He lowered his head. 1 inch, then another, until his forehead was even with hers. They stood like that for 7 full seconds. When Ghost stepped back, Ava was still breathing. Still standing. Still silent but different. Something in her shoulders had changed. Unlocked. Jacob looked up and saw Keaton watching. The old man didn't smile, but he nodded once, barely perceptible. That was all Jacob needed. He turned back to the others. "All right," he said. "Let's meet him one at a time." Later, after the session had ended and the sun had dropped behind the far ridge, Jacob led Ghost down toward the clearing. The wind had picked up again, but it was gentle, more a nudge than a push. They walked past the tree where the first piece of rope still hung frayed and forgotten. Past the ridge, where the trail had once broken apart. Past the spot where Jacob had screamed into the cold. All of it still there, but different now. He looked up at the mountain, then down at the valley. "Remember the day we got lost?" he said softly. Ghost flicked his ear. Jacob chuckled. "You saved me. You know that, right?" Ghost didn't respond. Didn't need to. They reached the edge of the field, where the old rail tracks still lay broken, rusted, half buried in snow. But this time there was something new. A wooden sign, carved by hand. Simple. Silver Pine Equine Therapy Center. Below it, in smaller letters, for those still learning to trust their legs, their voice, or the ground beneath them. Jacob ran his hand over the wood. It still smelled like sap. From behind him came footsteps, light, cautious. Alma. She carried a thermos in one hand and a brown paper sack in the other. "I brought stew," she said. "Not for you, for Keaton. But I know you'll steal half of it anyway." Jacob smirked. "I have no idea what you're talking about." She handed him the bag. "There's cornbread, too." Ghost nudged her shoulder as she passed. She turned and gave him a square sugar cube from her pocket. Jacob watched her disappear into the barn, then turned back toward the rail. He stood there a moment, remembering all the things that had once broken him, all the people who hadn't come, and all the ones who eventually had. He reached into his coat and pulled out the watch. Still cracked, still ticking. He didn't wear it as much now, but he never let it stray far. He placed it on one of the old rail ties. Let it sit there, just for a moment, then picked it back up and slid it into his pocket. The sun dipped low, and the snow began to fall again. This time not as threat, as a kind of peace. The snow had softened by morning. No longer the jagged, punishing storm of months past, just a gentle hush across the valley like the earth itself was exhaling. The trees stood tall and still, blanketed in white, and every surface glistened faintly beneath the early light. Everything was quiet, but not empty. This was the day. Jacob stepped through the open barn doors, his breath visible in the air. His coat lined with wear and dust, and memory swung gently around his knees. His boots sank half an inch into the snow, with every step slow and certain. Behind him the children followed. Ava, now speaking in full sentences, walked with a light hand on Ghost's bridle. Owen, who once flinched at every sound, now laughed aloud when the cold wind nipped at his ears. There were 6 of them this time, each different, each carrying things they never said aloud. But they followed Jacob like pilgrims behind a flame. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Ghost led the way, his hooves pressing quiet prints into the snow. He moved as if he remembered this path, not the route itself, but the feeling beneath it. Something deep in his bones told him where they were going. They passed the ridge, the edge of the ravine, the broken trail that once swallowed Jacob whole. No one pointed. No one looked down. They climbed slowly toward the plateau. The climb was shorter now, thanks to months of clearing and carving and effort. Still steep, still unforgiving, but doable. By the time they reached the top, the sun had lifted above the tree line. Gold spread across the snow like a blessing. There ahead of them lay the old track, still rusted, still cracked, but now lined with flowers. Dozens of them, wild, defiant things that had been planted months ago by Jacob and Alma and a few volunteers. Lavender, white daisies, even tiny flame-orange poppies somehow surviving beneath the frost. The children stopped when they saw it. Jacob stepped forward and stood in the center of the tracks. He turned to face them. "This line used to go somewhere," he said. His voice was steady, deeper than it once was. And then it didn't. Ava tilted her head. "So it's broken." Jacob shook his head. "No, it's waiting." The others watched him carefully. He pulled something from his coat pocket. The watch. Still cracked. Still ticking. He held it in his palm and raised it just slightly. "When I was your age, I thought if something stopped working, if it broke, it meant it was over. He looked around at them, but that's not true. Sometimes it just means you're supposed to start again. The children stood on either side of the rail line now. Some knelt to touch the flowers. Others just stared at the metal beneath their feet. A soft wind passed. Jacob looked out toward the trees, his eyes following the rails as they disappeared into snow and distance. Then he smiled. "Some roads don't lead anywhere," he said quietly. "Unless you decide they do." He closed his fist around the watch. The ticking felt louder in his hand. Ava stepped beside him and reached for Ghost. She brushed her fingers through his mane. Ghost stood still, proud, present, a living symbol of everything they weren't supposed to survive, but did. Then Jacob stepped aside. He let the children pass him one by one along the track. He didn't walk with them. He stayed where he was, watching, breathing, letting it be theirs. As they moved forward, the camera rose higher, capturing the line of small figures cutting across the white. The trail they left behind wasn't a wound in the snow. It was a signature. Proof. At the edge of the clearing in the far distance, a gray blur galloped across the frame. Ghost, untethered, free, not running from something, but toward something. His breath plumed like fire. His mane whipped behind him like a banner. He was faster than he'd ever been. And for a moment, just one perfect frame, he was airborne, suspended between sky and ground, like a spirit refusing to fade. Then gone. The wind carried the sound of hooves long after he vanished. Jacob turned toward the trees. He didn't chase. He just stood there, eyes wide, chest still. He opened his hand again. The watch blinked. 47 p.m. Tick, tick. Still running. Still alive. He exhaled slow and steady and whispered, "Thank you."